Right. Well, hey, everybody. It's good to be here with you from Texas, and I'm excited to share a little bit of our journey and talk about why. Why are we here? I think it's clear why we're all here. There's no real need to try to convince you of anything that you don't already know. We're very clear on a few things. We're clear that the need is overwhelming and that there's opportunities on a number of different levels for all kinds of people to step in and engage. We're very clear that there's a need, and we're also very clear that God cares about this and that we should do something about it. And so there's no real need to convince you of some of these things that you already know. And so part of what we want to do here during this time is not to convince you of things that you already know, but to maybe give you some language and some ideas for how you can go back to your churches and communicate some of these things to your people, to pastor and to shepherd your people well. And there's no one script for all, but there's certainly some ideas that we have found to be helpful and engaging as we communicate this to the audiences that God puts in front of us. And oftentimes what we find for primary communicators within churches is that theologically, this is a very clear thing, and conceptually, this is a very clear thing. Sometimes experientially is a difficult thing to really put yourself in the shoes of and in the framework of someone that understands the uniquenesses and the nuances and the dynamics of this if you as a primary communicator in your church maybe haven't walked some of these roads. And so sometimes the rub that we feel as communicators within churches is how do I tell other people what they should be doing when I'm not even doing that myself? And that's a tension that we've all experienced if you're a primary communicator in a church. At any level. I grew up in a pastor's home, and I vividly remember as a PK sitting on the front row, listening to my dad preach, thinking, you don't do that, you know, and just being this super judgmental, like 13-year-old kid, right? And swearing off to God, like swearing off the whole idea of ministry because I was terrified that maybe one day I would have to stand in front of people and also be a hypocrite, right? And especially, and if you're a pastor or preacher in a church, you know this, like the absolute worst sermons to preach are about marriage and parenting, right? Because you're just like, look, folks, let's be clear. Like, I don't want my wife sitting in the audience when I'm preaching a sermon on marriage, right? So there's just sometimes this, I just need helpful words to communicate clearly, especially if it's something that I myself am growing in, or maybe don't have experiential knowledge and understanding in, and that's okay. And so part of what we want to do during this time is give you words that you can then take and contextualize and nuance and discard and edit and begin to formulate how do we want to talk about this with our church in terms of why are we going to engage in this. So my background is church-based ministry, and that included church planting in Houston, and that is where my wife and I became foster parents 2 years into our church plant. Our daughters were 5, 3, and 1. Our church plant was growing like crazy and just trying to keep up, and in all the course of human history and all the creation of time, my wife decides now is the perfect time for us to become foster parents. And I thought, that's so funny that you and I live in the same world, but we just live in completely different worlds. Because I would think that this is the exact wrong time in all the course of human history and the creation of time for us to become foster parents. And so we had about 8 months of cordial conversation, and that resulted in this picture of the world that I come from. And so let me explain. That's my wife, Emily, there in the back. 20 years next month, which is wild to be able to say. And then what we've got in the blue Texas shirt is Darby, and then Presley in the gray tank top. Going to our left, we've got Macy, second from the left. She's our oldest biological daughter. And then in the front there, we've got Marley in the glasses. Marley came to live with us when she was 3 days old in Houston. And she was the direct result of me saying, God, we'll do whatever you want us to do as long as it fits within this very tiny, small, comfortable, manageable box. And that involves only bringing in infant baby girls. And in hindsight, I see that God obliged me and said, I'll make that deal with you, but I'm not going to tell you what will unfold as a result of this. And what unfolded is my wife becoming aware of young moms. And when my wife becomes aware of situations, I don't know how your marriage works, but when my wife becomes aware of a situation, that is the equivalent of us having prayed about it and talked about it for a long time. It's done. And so my job is to not talk about the situation that she's become aware of, but it's to figure out how we're going to handle the situation that she's become aware of. So that's how our dynamic works. And so we had a mom move in with us that was 23 years old, and she had just given birth to infant twin girls. And the objective there was to keep these little girls out of the system, out of foster care. And so there's a long story behind that. And then they lived with us for quite some time. And then on the heels of that, we had Gianna move in with us in this picture, who was 17 when we met her, had grown up in care since she was 6, and had just given birth to her little baby boy, Jordan, who I'm holding in this picture. He was 1 week old when we met him. And so this picture is about 1.5 years outdated, because you understand, if you're involved in foster care, that there's really no point in paying a professional to take family pictures, because they'll be quickly out of date and you'll have wasted like $400, right? And so this is the most recent 1.5 years old non-professional family photo, and it's so out of date that there's actually another baby missing from this picture now. And so Kiana is 22 years old now, has 3 little ones, and she is by no means without struggle. We have by no means fixed her, and that's not really even the objective. We've by no means saved her. That was not even an expectation. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot of things in her life now that are worse than they were when we met her. Not to say that we're horrible foster parents, but to say that when you're 17 years old and you've grown up in care since you were 6, things don't just change overnight. And so she's not without her struggles now, but here's the difference now, is that our families are now one. And she knows that while she'll continue to experience struggle and growth and 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, she's not on that journey alone anymore. That she's now integrated with the family. As a matter of fact, we've just been texting each other this morning because she's asking for money, and we're doing that song and dance now, because that's what a dad does with their kiddos, right? So this is the story I come from, a little bit of context, and I want to share with you a story that I think many of us have come across. You change the setting, you change the context, change the characters, and we've all come across these stories that are sometimes in the news, and they're stories of good Samaritans, of people that just do these heroic things, and they're stories that are compelling to us and that draw us in, I think, for a couple of reasons, because we put ourselves in those stories and we say, oh my gosh, if I came across a situation like that, what would I do? Would I do the same thing that what this Good Samaritan did in this particular situation? And so here's one of my favorites I came across not long ago in Southern California, about a guy that sees a problem and he rushes towards the problem. Check this out.
Before this car went up in flames, the driver was pulled out by a Good Samaritan on his way to lunch at the Bollinger Road Shopping Plaza. Ram Harutsunyan says there were dozens of bystanders, but no one stepped up. He's in the white shirt, and you can see him run up to the driver and pull and drag him to safety before paramedics and firefighters arrive. His friend Leo shot this video of the rescue and put it on YouTube.
It was pretty surreal once we started.
I love it. So we've seen the story a million times in the news. Change the setting, change the characters, and it's somebody that sees a problem and they run up towards it. And then you've got the Leos, and I identify with the Leo in these stories, right? His friend Leo recorded the whole thing on his phone and uploaded it to YouTube, right? Like, I'm perfectly okay with being Leo in that story, right? And then you've got guys like Aram, and he's asked later by a reporter, why did you do it? Why did you run towards a burning car and pull someone out that you don't even know? And I love his matter-of-fact, simple answer that he gave. He essentially said, well, no one else was and someone needed to, and so why not me? Just real simple. There's a problem in front of me and somebody needs help, and why would I not? We live in a world that overtly at times, and certainly subconsciously communicates a very clear message to us. And this message, the church itself is not inoculated from this message. I'm convinced that week in and week out, we have people sitting in our comfortable church seats or our comfortable pews, whatever your flavor, that are wrestling with this narrative that the world clearly communicates to all of us, which is this: the objective of your life is to do whatever you have to do to avoid anything that's hard or difficult or uncomfortable. Never be the Aram, always be the Leo. And if you ever see anything that's hard or difficult or uncomfortable, then move away from it. Isolate yourself from it. Insulate yourself from it. And go to extremes if you need to at times. Literally move away from it if you have to. Avoid anything that's hard or difficult or uncomfortable. And then we come across stories like Aram running towards a burning car, and we go, gosh, what a beautiful story. Why? It's so compelling to us because I think down deep in all of us is built this innate desire to live a life that actually counts for something. And we recognize this tension which exists between the narrative of isolate and insulate and avoid anything that's difficult, and yet still somehow simultaneously live a life that matters and counts, and we're conflicted. Can those two things coexist at once? And I think all of us in the room know that no, one of those has to give. One of them does. And burrowed deep down within us, I'm convinced, and everyone that enters our church, is this desire to ensure that our life matters for something. For something. And what that's going to require is a complete flipping of the narrative that is ultimately dictating the decisions that we make. That no longer are we the kind of people that isolate and insulate, but now what compels us to be the kind of people that move towards and not away? I'm convinced that the gospel speaks directly to this narrative, and it confronts this narrative, and it creates this tension with this narrative that we're then left to resolve. What are we going to do with it? Something's got to give. That in a nutshell, the story of the gospel and what we celebrate about the work and the person of Jesus on our behalf is that it clearly communicates something to us about God and God's disposition towards hard and difficult things. That he is not a God that sees hard and difficult and broken things and moves away from them, but instead he's a God that sees hard and difficult and broken things and moves towards them. We are now mid-May. We have 7.5 months to get ready to preach the best Christmas sermon we've ever preached. Because Christmas is just this easy layup that God gives us to communicate to our people his heart for broken people. His heart for vulnerable people. Because what we celebrate at Christmas is this beautiful demonstration of God very tangibly saying to us, I see you where you are, and I'm coming after you. I'm wrapping myself up in your brokenness. I'm allowing your brokenness to break me so that you don't have to be broken anymore. I'm entering into your story through the person of Jesus. I see you where you are, and I am coming after you. This is the essence of Christmas. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 through 7, we see so much of the beauty of this unpacked by Paul. He says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. So that's Christmas right there. Another translation says at just the right time, God sent forth his son. This idea that God's timing is perfect, that it's not by accident, that he decides right now is the right time for me to enter into their story. That God sent forth his son, born of a woman. We know her name to be Mary, born under the law. We don't talk about that a lot at Christmas, but it's still very true at Christmas. We save that for Easter, and really more specifically, Good Friday of Easter. This idea that Jesus was born under the weight of condemnation. And Jesus himself says it. I've come to give my life as a ransom. I was born to die. I was born to take on the brokenness of broken people and to be crushed by it, so that they don't have to be crushed anymore. This is verse 4. This is Christmas, the essence of Christmas, that Jesus was born to die for us. This is what we celebrate at just the right time. If you're in a seminary class, many of you have been in them, this is where the professor says this is what we call the doctrine of incarnation. The doctrine of incarnation, the idea that God would wrap himself up in humanity in the person of Jesus. And so I'm a Texas boy. I grew up in Texas. We have these places in Texas called Tex-Mex restaurants, right? And you might have one here, but it's not the same, right? Tex-Mex restaurants are basically fake. It's basically fake Mexican food. It's Americanized Mexican food that if you go to Mexico and you get Mexican food, it's definitely not the same as Tex-Mex, but you go to Tex-Mex restaurants and you can order like a chili con carne or a queso con carne. And that phrase con carne means with meat or with beef. And it's the same root idea of the word incarne or incarnation. It's essentially God with meat on, or God with beef on, right? And I'm sure that my very astute, proper DTS professor rolls over in his grave every time he hears me illustrate the beauty of the doctrine of incarnation with Tex-Mex. But you'll never eat queso the same, right? It will now forever be a very spiritual experience for you. This is the idea that God now has meat on, that God is in the flesh. We can see him and touch him. And this is God very clearly communicating to humanity that I see you where you are and I'm coming after you. This is the essence of the gospel, that God is not the kind of God who says, I see you where you are, and whoa, it's bad. Like, it's real bad. And I really don't want anything to do with it. And so you need to get your act together and clean yourself up enough, and maybe one day you can work your way to where I am. We've all tried that. It's exhausting. It's impossible. It's disheartening. That's not the gospel. That's not good news. That's horrible news. The good news of the gospel is that God says, I see you where you are, and man, it's bad. And I'm going to step into it with you. And we're going to work this thing out. We're going to begin to write an entirely new story. This is where we get our Christmas verse, Matthew chapter 1. The idea that God will be Emmanuel. He's with us. This is why for years, for centuries, there were prophecies about the day is coming when God is going to be with us, Emmanuel among us. And people were like, that's too good to believe. There's no way he would do that. I can't believe that. And then it happens. And they're like, we knew it. Like, no, you didn't. What are you talking about, right? Because it's so unbelievable that God, a God of glory, a God of holiness, a God of perfection and righteousness would say, this is really, really bad. And I'm compelled towards that. I'm drawn towards that. And I'm going to move into that, and I'm going to become a part of that. This is what we celebrate. And so what we don't want is to be the kind of people that raise our hands in celebration to a God that has moved towards us in our hard and broken, while using those same hands to push the hard and broken of other people away. It's not what we want. And so now we're talking about identity. What kind of people do we want to be? We want to be the kind of people who raise our hands in celebration to the fact that God has moved towards us in our hard and broken, and who then look around and at opportunities to extend that into the lives of those around us. That's the kind of people that we want to be. We don't want to be the Leos. We want to be the Arams. We want to be the kind of people who very matter-of-factly and simply say, somebody needed to, and why would I not? It begins to change the questions that we ask. The gospel flips the narrative and the lens through which we live and view and understand the world around us, and it changes the questions that we ask. It's no longer a question of why would I? It's now a question of, well, in light of who I am, why would I not? That's really the question. Why would I not? Why would I not move towards instead of away? Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite writers, says this about compassion. He says, compassion is not a bending towards the underprivileged from a privileged position. It's not a reaching out from on high to those who are less fortunate below. It's not a gesture of sympathy or pity for those who fail to make it in the upward pull. On the contrary, compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute. And I love this. And building a home there. What a phrase. It means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there. John chapter 1 verse 14 says that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, or tabernacled among us, or built a home among us. There's a sense of permanency there. There's nothing wrong with service projects. But what we're talking about here is more than a service project, right? It's I'm moving in and I'm staying. And I'm reorienting my life now around this new neighborhood in which I live. That might literally be true. But what we're talking about is this complete reorientation of I'm moving towards places that I have been hardwired to move away from. And it's going to begin to change everything about the way that I live and the way that I see the world and the decisions that I make. If you've spent even 1 hour behind the curtain of child and family welfare, you understand what I mean when I say that you will never, ever, ever be able to see the world the same again. Everything changes. There's a sense of permanency there, that we're moving in and we're staying. Even when things get hard, one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Kurt Thompson, if you're not familiar with him, don't listen to anything else I'm saying right now. Just Google Dr. Kurt Thompson and just read. It's so much. Just read his stuff on your phone right now. It's better than what I'm saying, right? He uses this phrase often. He says, let's be the kind of people that enter into the rooms of others that are struggling, and we say, hey, we're in the room with you, and we're not leaving. I'm not leaving this room. This idea of, I'm building a home here, and you're stuck with me. One of the things that for the last 5 years we have been reiterating to Guyana, since the day that we met her, is this idea that you are stuck with us forever. We tell her this all the time, probably thousands of times now, and sometimes she rolls her eyes, yeah, I know, right? 5 years into this journey with her, and we're not convinced she believes it yet. Because for the last 5 years, she's tested it. Oh yeah? You're in the room with me and you're never leaving? Well, hold my beer, watch this, right? Like that's how it feels sometimes. And there's times that we're like, we got our hand on the doorknob, we're like, are we out? Nope. You're stuck with us forever. Whether you like it or not, you're stuck with us forever. This is what we celebrate in the gospel, that God sees hard places and broken people and he moves towards them and not away from them. He moves towards them and not away from them. Oh, I do have a Dr. Kurt Thompson quote. How could I not, right? He says it this way, God is never at a distance from that which we suffer. He is an intimate participant in our suffering on the way to making things new. I love that. An intimate participant on this journey of struggle and suffering on the way with this hopeful view that one day everything will be made new. That everything that's broken will be made right. That hard things will not be final things. That's what keeps us in the room. Is this absolute assurance that hard things will not be final things, and so it's worth staying in the room. So then, Paul begins to kind of unpack this a little bit, and in verse 5, he says, Jesus did all of this to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And so in verse 5, we're going to start flying through this for the sake of time. In verse 5, he uses some past tense language. He starts talking about the effects that this has had on our past, that we were under the law, and then you look in verse 4, Jesus was born under the law, and that's where we were under the law, and we have been redeemed out from underneath that law. We have been redeemed out from underneath the weight of condemnation. And we have been entered into this new family, this new security, this new provision, this new place, okay? So historically, I'll be sensitive. No, I won't be sensitive. I'll be clear here. I'll be sensitively clear here. The landscape of what it is that we're participating in has significantly swung towards churches looking around in their own backyard and recognizing that there's a child and family welfare crisis right in their backyard, and it's called foster care. And we have been very clear up here already that the expectation of foster care, the hope of foster care, is the restoration and the reconciliation of families. Sometimes that results in adoption. But historically, 15, 20 years plus ago, the primary conversation in the church was adoption. And so the theology of adoption was primarily used to emphasize and reinforce and to affirm God's heart for adopting kids, rightfully and beautifully. We are now in a landscape and in an environment where it can get tricky sometimes to exclusively use the theology of adoption to communicate our opportunity to engage in a space where adoption is not necessarily the goal. You following me? And this is why we tend to spend significantly more time talking about this idea of incarnation, of moving towards, rather than adoption. There are implications of adoption sometimes in moving towards, but it's not the only implication and it's not the only application. And so what we'll find when we talk about incarnation is this idea that as we become the kind of people that move towards, the applications of incarnation are going to take on a variety of different forms. All the way from opening our home to children, to wrapping around biological and kinship families, to mentorship, to working at a boys' ranch, to maybe even crossing the street because we know our neighbor is struggling and they just need somebody that's in the room with them and won't leave. So the applications of incarnation are, frankly, endless. And adoption is one of them. Make sense? Okay. So we see this word adoption here, this idea that God has entered us into this new family, and something has changed about our past. Romans chapter 8 says that there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The law of the Spirit of life has set us free from the law of sin and death. And so something has changed about our past. Jesus steps into our story and it changes our past. Now, what happens with our past? I wish what happened with our past sometimes is that Jesus would step in and say, I now wipe your memory clean of all of your past. It's like it never happened. Remember growing up in Sunday school and they would say that to help you understand justification, they would say justification is just as if it never happened. Just as if. Justification, like a cute way to teach us really bad theology, right? It's not just as if it never happened. No, it very much did happen. And it's real, and we remember them, things that we've done or things that have been done to us. And so I think what Paul is saying here is that when the gospel begins to change your entire story, it doesn't eradicate your past, it doesn't make your past disappear, but it changes your relationship with your past. It goes from a source of condemnation or guilt or shame to now a platform of celebration. Because we can look back on our past and say, wow, look at what Jesus has done. I was dead and now I'm alive. I was blind and now I can see. I was lame and now I can walk. It transforms the relationship that we have with our past from a source of condemnation. There's therefore now no condemnation in Romans 8 to now a platform of celebration. And so part of the reason that you and I are compelled by the gospel to move towards hard places and broken people is, in effect, to very tangibly to be intimate participators with them in this transforming of their relationship with their past. Not to be saviors, but to be intimate participants with them as they process through the opportunity they have to reframe and transform the relationship they have with their past. From a source of condemnation that's going to drag me down and define me the rest of my life, to perhaps now a platform of celebration that's going to compel me forward. So not long after Guyana moved into our home, she knocked on our door late one night. I say late one night, it was probably like 9:15, and we got the girls down, and we're just like, what a day, glad it's over, everyone survived, and ate something, we're not sure what it was, but ate something, and we're just gonna veg out to like Chip and JoJo or something, right? And it was that time of the night, you all know what I'm saying. And she knocks on our door and says, she asked a 3-word question that just always haunts me living in the home that I live in, because nothing small or short follows this question. She knocks on the door and she says, can we talk? Like, oh my gosh, like, is there any worse of a question when all you want to do is not talk, right? We say, of course, come on in. What's on your mind? And she says, hey, I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up. This is a 17-and-a-half-year-old kid. This is a 17-and-a-half-year-old kid in age. This is probably a 12 or 13-year-old kid emotionally. I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up. And you guys know this. This is a girl that has spent every day of her life surviving, and she is an incredibly good survivor. An incredibly good survivor. She knows what she's got to do. She knows how to get what she needs. But when all that you have is time to survive, there's no room to dream. There's no room to think about tomorrow. Again, Kurt Thompson says what trauma does is it destroys our capacity to dream. He says, so imagine if a kid has a near drowning experience, he falls in the pool and almost drowns, someone pulls him out, brushes him off, says, hey, you're okay, all right, get back in, buddy. And in that kid's mind, he's thinking, I can't even imagine getting back in that pool. Why? Because the traumatic experience has now begun to destroy his ability to imagine. And then what trauma does is that it takes it further. Not only can I not imagine getting in that pool, but I don't even like the pool. Our brain tricks itself into convincing us that I don't even like swimming. When really underneath, I know you actually really do love swimming, but trauma has destroyed your ability to even imagine ever getting in the pool again. And so this is what trauma does. When all that you have to do is survive, it destroys your ability to dream and imagine. And then it convinces you that I don't even want to. Yeah, well, yes, you do. We just got to get underneath the layers of that. And so if she knocks on our door late one night, I've been thinking about what I want to be. We say, what is it? And she says, I want to be a social worker. I want to be a caseworker for kids in foster care. We say, Guyana, how awful is it that the job even has to exist? But how beautiful would it be for a kid to have a really rough day, you to be the one to walk in the room, look him in the eye and say, hey, I get it. You are me, I am you. We're in this together. What struck us that night is that, of course, Guyana was dreaming about her future, but probably even more than that is that her imagining about what her future could be were rooted in her past experience. Because what she told us is that these kids deserve good caseworkers. All I ever had my whole life was bad ones. They made my life worse, and these kids deserve good ones. She has every right in the world to use her past experience as a crux and as an excuse. And she's working really, really hard to not to change the relationship she has with her past. Let's move faster. Okay. So then Paul starts talking about our present. He says, because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. This is present tense language. So our past relationship has been redeemed. Our present has now been shifted. He says, right now you have the Spirit of God. That Spirit gives us the capacity to refer to God and relate to God in an entirely new way. That word Abba, we all know probably, is a tender and affectionate form of the word Father. And so Paul's being a bit redundant here. It's as if he's saying Father, Father, but one of those fathers is more like a daddy kind of word. And so all my girls call me daddy, and I'm going to ride the daddy train as long as I possibly can, right? Even if they're like 41 and it's awkward that they call me daddy, I'm cool with it, right? I texted my 16-year-old the other day. She didn't answer me, which was fine. I got home, and her phone was on the counter. Anytime I ever see like one of my kids' phones just laying around, not being touched or used, I think like, this is incredible, right? I'm so glad that it's not in their hand, right? And so I walked in, I was like, awesome, that's why she didn't text me back, that's great. But my text, I saw it was still popping up on the screen, and the name on the text said Dad. So I quickly got into her phone and corrected that, and moved it back to Daddy. Now, I'm the only dad in the house. So am I father? Yes. Is there a sense of like authority and properness associated with that? Yeah. So what's more important for me right now for my girls to understand is, yeah, I'm father, but I care far more that you understand me as and relate to me as daddy, for obvious reasons. There's a sense of comfort there. There's a sense of acceptance there. There's a sense of security there. The idea of climbing up into father's arms, right, when I'm struggling, is very different than climbing up into daddy's arms, you know? So I think what Paul is suggesting here is that when Jesus steps into our story and changes everything, it changes the relationship that we have with our past, and it kind of washes over us this new sense of present security, that I can live now fully secure. I don't just have to survive now. I don't have to prove myself now. I don't have to justify myself now. I don't have to whitewash things with God. I don't have to play games with Him. I can just come to Him with anything and everything, and I know exactly how He's going to respond to me, like a good daddy would. There's a present security there now. So why do we move towards hard places? Why do we move towards struggling people? In part, to be intimate participators and helping to cultivate an environment where they can experience what it feels like to live with an absolute security. You don't have to fight. You don't have to claw. You don't have to survive today. You can rest today knowing that there are people around you holding you up and helping you, that are for you, and we're not leaving the room. We're not leaving the room. So our present has been shifted. Paul continues. He says now something about our past. You're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. This is now future language. An heir is someone who lives today with the assurance of what's to come tomorrow. So the Scripture often speaks of what's to come tomorrow in our future, and it says a couple of things. The first thing that it says is that what we can expect in our future is that glory is coming. That while our outward bodies waste away, our inward souls groan for, along with all of creation, the glory that will be revealed. And the older I get, the more I believe in the inerrancy and the accuracy of Scripture. When it says that while our outward bodies waste away, I'm like, yep, yes and amen. Understand that more now. And our inward souls groan for the glory that will be revealed. Like, yeah, I resonate with that now in ways that I didn't when I was 20, right? It says that our present struggles are heavy and hard, but they pale in comparison to the weight of glory that will be revealed. Glory is coming. This is our hope. This is our inheritance. But Scripture also says something else about what to expect in our future. It says that while on one hand glory is coming, another reality will play itself out simultaneously as well, and they'll run parallel with each other, and they'll integrate with each other, and then one day everything that's wrong will be made right. Glory is coming, but then Jesus also says, hey, as we hope for that and as we work towards that, things are going to become increasingly bumpy along the way. I am absolutely convinced, and I could be wrong. I have been in the past. But I'm absolutely convinced that the current social and political climate that we live in does not surprise Jesus at all. Does not catch him off guard. I think he's been very clear all along. Things are going to become increasingly bumpy along the way. But glory is coming. But in the end, I win over all of this. That is our present assurance and our future hope. Our future has now been altered. Why do we move towards hard places and people that are struggling? Why do we incarnate? Why do we say, I see you where you are and I'm moving towards you? In part, so that people who have been convinced that there's no time to dream about the future, there's no point in dreaming about the future, and there is no hope in your future, can begin to experience what it feels like to have someone whose door they can knock on late one night and say, hey, can we talk? I've been dreaming a little bit. That we can be intimate participators with them in helping to cultivate an environment in which they can begin to experience healing from the trauma which has destroyed their ability to dream and imagine, and it can begin to open up some glimpses of hope for them. That it doesn't always have to be this way, doesn't always have to be how it's been. I can live today knowing I'm fully loved, and I can actually now begin to dream about what the future looks like. I don't have to be afraid anymore. This is why we move towards the hard and the difficult. 3 things the gospel does. I think it compels us towards this. It reframes our posture towards the hard and broken. It sustains us in the midst of it. It reminds us that hope is an intimate participator in all of this. So the gospel doesn't just trick us into it and then or guilt us into it. Jesus saved you, and so you should probably do something to pay him back, and then good luck figuring out the rest. No. It compels us into this, and then it sustains us in the midst of it. When we've got our hand on that doorknob and we're considering leaving the room, what keeps us? What keeps us? I'm convinced the gospel keeps us. The gospel keeps us there. And it proclaims a story through it. It reflects the capacity of God to bring great beauty out of tragic brokenness. This is our story. So when I have the unbelievable opportunity to preach at churches, and they'll say, can you come and preach? We're going to do a thing on foster care and adoption. I'll say, yeah. But just to be clear, about 95% of the sermon is really just going to be about the gospel. And then there's going to be a little application of one of the most beautiful ways that we can demonstrate with purity and undefiledness what it is that we celebrate is by moving towards some of the most vulnerable children and families in our community around us. And here's opportunities to do that. And so then we get into James 1:27, and then we'll be done here. I got a lot more, but we'll be done, I promise. So we're working on using language that's helpful. We're working on using theology that's helpful. We're working on using messages that are helpful. We're working on discipling our people by helping them become more intimate and deep celebrators of the gospel for themselves, and then providing pathways through which they can become wider demonstrators of that gospel into the lives of those around them. I think we need to be very, very, very careful that we are not asking people to only demonstrate what we believe about the gospel without first inviting them to become deeper and more intimate celebrators of that gospel for themselves. Because that's ultimately what will sustain them. That we are first in the business of discipleship within our churches. Discipleship. We are first in the business of discipling people who will meet needs, not simply trying to recruit people to meet needs. Because what happens when all that we do is recruit people to meet needs, and then that need gets a little too hard or uncomfortable for them? They say, well, that was fun. I am done. Someone else can meet that need now. It's beginning to cramp my style a little bit. Or sometimes, if we're not careful, we can unintentionally pacify and satiate the need that people have to meet a need and to feel good about the fact that they met a need. And then they say, I feel really good about my need to meet a need being satisfied, and now I'm done. But we understand that at some point, the need gets unbelievably and unbearably hard. And you begin to ask yourself the question, why do we continue to intentionally put ourselves through this when we could have chosen and still can now choose to not to? What keeps us in the room? The need to meet a need? No. What keeps us in the room is the belief that hard things will not be final things. That God has the capacity to take broken things and turn them into beautiful things. That as we become more deep and intimate celebrators of the gospel, it changes the narrative through which we live and the questions that we ask. It's no longer, why would I? It's now, gosh, in light of what Jesus has done for me, why would I not? That's what keeps us. We disciple people first. And then we invite them to consider the unique and beautiful ways that God is inviting them to demonstrate for others what they celebrate in themselves. So James 1:27, very quickly. The unique thing about James 1:27 is that it's often referred to as a command. This is the command that kind of tells us what to do. And what's actually true is that this isn't a command. There's no command language in here. This isn't telling us what to do. It's a descriptive verse. It's describing for us what it looks like when we do what we're supposed to do. That's different, right? So it's not saying do this. It's saying here's what it looks like when we do this. Okay? So let's pick it apart real quick. This is what seminary does. Takes perfectly fine things and then turns them into different things. You're like, what? I was fine the way it was, right? But this is so much better. So it says religion. That's not our word religion. It's not cathedrals and steeples. It's an outward display of what's inwardly true. It's this idea of here's what I believe inwardly and here's how it manifests outwardly. And one of the purest and most undefiled, the word there is the root word that we get our words catheter from, or cathartic, which are these cleansing things. The idea is clean. One of the cleanest outward displays of what we believe is inwardly true is to visit or to move towards, get involved with. There's a sense of permanency in this word. It's not temporarily, it's this reorientation of our lives to visit, to move towards orphans and widows. And so, does James talk about orphans and widows? Yes. I'm convinced that this isn't a prescriptive verse, it's a description. It's describing for us what it looks like when we move towards. When we move towards, it says something very pure and clean about what we believe about God. And so as it's a descriptive verse, I'm convinced that if we went to James and said, what about kids in foster care, vulnerable families? What about my struggling neighbor across the street, trafficking victims, all of these other people? I don't think James would say, I don't care about them, right? I said orphans and widows only, you ignore everybody else. Of course not. I think what James is doing, and I could be wrong, but I'm going to be wrong on the side of James saying, yep, those people too. I choose that. I think James is using orphans and widows in his day, the husbandless and the fatherless, some of the most pushed aside people to the margins of his society. I think he's using them as representatives of a broader collection of people. I think if we went to James and said, what about kids in foster care? What about their families? What about their communities? What about victims of trafficking and homelessness and incarceration? I think James would say, yes, 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 yes. Those are our people. That's what we do. That's where we go. That's where we go. And when we do that, when we move towards the people that tend to be the most pushed aside to the margins of our culture, it puts the gospel on display with a cleanliness and a purity unlike anything else. Unlike anything else. And I wish we had time to continue, but we'll stop right there. So can I pray for us and then transition? So Father, I do pray that you would help us, even in this room, become more intimate and deep celebrators of the gospel for ourselves, and that you would remind us of the goodness of Jesus towards us, and that you would draw our attention to those places in our lives where you have clearly demonstrated you are able to take very broken things and create beautiful things out of them. And let us just sit in that remembrance, and then let that remembrance nourish us and refresh us in the work that we are doing on behalf of others. Let us believe that for the sake of others. And then let that compel us and sustain us as we do the work that we do. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen.